All right, good morning. Welcome to class. Hope everyone's doing well today. So just to remind everyone, we have the Unit 1 quizzes, which include Chapter 1, 2, and 10. Those are going to be due tonight at 11:59 p.m. without exception, so make sure you get them in at some point before then. They shouldn't take very long. They should take probably, I'd say, around 10 minutes apiece. It's just 10 question matching multiple choice, or just matching, so should be really straightforward there. Shouldn't be any major issues. You can use any resources you want on the quiz, so certainly I don't anticipate that being a very challenge. You do have one attempt per quiz, so make sure you do it right the first time. But apart from that, that's pretty much all the analysis we have. We will have the exam. We're going to talk about that today, but before we do, I'm just going to go over briefly the technology guide for not chapter 1, but just the first technology guide. So a lot of the content in this is going to probably be a review for a lot of you. You're probably pretty familiar with the basics of hardware. We're not going to go very in-depth in hardware. We are going to cover a little bit of history, talk about some of the different components that you need to know, different form factors of technological devices, and we'll wrap up with a brief discussion on managerial issues with technology. So, like I say, you're probably familiar with a lot of these form factors. Of course, you have your basic smartphone. It allows for communication pretty much worldwide, doing lots of basic tasks, fits in a pocket, has a battery. You get the idea there. Kind of similar to a tablet in a lot of functions, only a tablet, of course, has a larger screen. Maybe it's better for reading. Kind of depends on what you prefer to do there. A laptop, of course, is a more traditional computing device where it's portable. It has a battery just like the other two, but it allows you to do more traditional tasks. We're talking about managing a file system in a traditional sense. It's probably going to be a lot more. Of course, you can run apps on smartphones and tablets. You can run desktop applications on a laptop. So for a lot of business applications, that could be something very useful. Certainly having a full version of whatever application you're wanting to use could be superior to whatever the app is, but it just depends on the specifics. And then lastly, of course, a desktop, simply a computer that typically does not have a battery, at least not a battery that allows the system to run. Of course, we could split hairs and say, what about a UPS that powers a desktop? You can certainly make that case. Basically, I think you know the difference between a desktop and a laptop, though. So one thing that's important to kind of discuss is how do we actually get information into a system? Well, we use input, and some of the types of input I have listed here. A mouse, a keyboard. If you wanted to have some sort of system that was going to be taking information in, something that's not up here. Imagine you are a store. You could certainly use a barcode scanner to input information into the system. So basically, just any type of device that allows you to take input from a user or from some, doesn't even have to be from a user, it could be from anywhere, and to store, that's going to be an input. So I have a sensor up here as well. Anything like that basically just is going to allow you to gather that information. Of course, that contrasts with output. Output is simply the display of information in some fashion. So right now, we're using a projector. I'm using a screen. So certainly those sorts of things. We could also have printed information. Use some sort of a printer. You could listen. If you're watching this video after the fact, you should be able to hear. That is output, the sound. So all those sorts of things allow us to get information back from a system in the form of output. Now again, I'm just going to briefly go through these components of computers, probably review for most people. So you will need to recognize one of the components. I'm pretty sure it's a CPU. So that's what this is right here. I'm not saying I'm pretty sure that's a CPU. I know that's a CPU. I'm saying on the exam, I'm pretty sure I have a question where you recognize a CPU, just to kind of clarify that. So basically, it's going to be responsible for most of the computational tasks. Typically speaking, it could or could not be responsible for graphic tasks. And you could also make an argument that you could use additional sorts of processors beyond the central processor, so central processing unit. You can certainly use other processors for a lot of what you're going to be using. So it's kind of important to keep in mind that this is not necessarily the only processing device inside of a computer. Sorry about the cord there. I accidentally bumped it. Give me just a second, guys. All right, sorry about that. I need to be more careful, a little less clumsy. So yeah, certainly that's where most of the computational tasks are going to take place. Of course, RAM is going to be for short-term storage. So it's going to be a volatile memory, meaning that as soon as the system is powered down, anything stored within it is wiped. It's also going to be wiped while the system is on, depending upon if, whatever's inside of it is no longer needed. So basically, it's just going to be for that very short-term storage. Of course, that's not to be confused with the cache inside of a CPU or any other processing unit. It's going to be for even shorter-term storage, and it's going to be much smaller. So then, of course, we have for longer-term storage, it's going to be memory that, if you power it down, it's still going to be there. So, of course, we have a hard drive on the left. It's a standard 3.5-inch hard drive. Below that, we have a 2.5-inch hard drive, typical laptop form factor hard drive versus desktop form factor. The solid-state drive, both of those are examples on the right. So we have a 2.5-inch solid-state drive, and we have, I believe that is a M.2 NVMe solid-state drive. So yes, the difference between a solid-state drive and a hard drive is one of them has the data stored on platters that spin around, typically anywhere from 5,400 RPM to probably the most common is going to be 7,200, but they can go up to, I've seen 15,000. So, of course, in the solid-state drive, there's no moving parts or anything. It's why it's called solid-state. So certainly keep that in mind. It's going to be faster and more energy efficient to use solid-state than it is to use traditional magnetic drives like you see on the left there. Of course, the motherboard is going to be the component that basically allows all the other components to interface with each other. So we have socket for the CPU, socket for the RAM, expansion slots up here, your I/O, all that sort of stuff. So basically, this is just what kind of allows everything to connect. Probably a more interesting discussion is discussion of enterprise hardware. Like I say, all that stuff you had before, probably a review. But when we talk about enterprise hardware, we're really saying, how can we best meet a manager's, or not necessarily a manager, how can we best meet a firm's needs? And one way to do that is to have equipment that suits the purpose. So when we think about a traditional office employee, what are they doing? Maybe a little bit of web browsing, maybe some light office applications. They're not likely doing anything that's computationally intensive. That's going to contrast a lot with people doing maybe some sort of analytics, maybe some sort of animation, maybe some sort of 3D modeling. So there's different types of devices that suit those different types of tasks. On the left here, we see an example of a workstation. Now, what's the difference between a workstation and a PC? Well, the workstation is built using server-grade equipment. So it's basically the difference is that it uses different types of memory. It's also going to use slightly more robust CPUs and other stuff like that. But that's advantageous because not only is that going to have more support for those specific applications being used on the system, it's also going to allow the firm, if there's any sort of problem, to not have any loss of data, or to at least minimize the likelihood of loss of data. So, for example, if you had a traditional PC and a RAM stick went bad in it while it was operating, what would happen? Well, a lot of things could happen. One thing that you could see happen is anything that's stored on that specific part of the RAM that's bad could become corrupt. And if it becomes corrupted, that means you lost data. Well, in error-correcting memory, like the workstation will use, you're not going to have that problem. So certainly anything that's going to be a very computationally intensive task, you don't want to have it. Imagine if your database was inputting, let's say, every 100th record completely wrong. Will that be a problem? Be a pretty large problem, I would say. So certainly, that's why you use that server-grade equipment. Now, of course, in a database, probably not going to be storing that on a workstation. You're probably going to be using some sort of a server. So when we talk about servers, we're talking about something that's going to be extremely stationary. These are literally bolted to the floor. And they're going to allow us to do lots of tasks, whatever we decide to put on them, we can easily do. It's going to be different form factors. It's going to be measured in U. 1 U is 1.75 inches high. So we can have a 1U server, it's going to be about this high, 2U is going to be about this high, we can get up to 4U, we can go on from there. But just keep in mind, that's what we're going to be discussing with a traditional server. We can run anything we want to on it. There's no limitation as to what we can install and run on it. Pretty much anything that the hardware is capable of, it can do. So pretty straightforward. It's going to contrast a little bit with a traditional server. We're typically thinking of something, it's going to be a fixed piece of hardware. Sure, you can upgrade it depending on the height and stuff like that. There could be multiple CPUs. When we're talking about a blade server, this is going to be something where it's going to be very costly. If you were to purchase a typical blade server, you're probably going to spend about $50,000 on just the blade alone. Now, this is advantageous for some firms because each of these individual, they're called blades, you can take them and you can purchase them as needed. So it's a lot more scalable than a traditional server infrastructure would otherwise be. Now, of course, you could also make an argument. What if you purchase additional servers? And that's a very fair point. If you purchase and sold servers as needed, you can certainly get around some of these issues. But in the general sense, a blade server is going to allow for enhanced scalability. And it's going to be beneficial because imagine if your firm grows. Then it's going to be very easy to purchase additional blades for your infrastructure. Whereas with this more traditional infrastructure with just a standard server, you can purchase additional servers, but it's a lot more difficult, whereas literally just slot it into a blade. So, any questions about any of that so far? Okay, let's kind of shift gears a little bit now. Just kind of went a little bit fast there with some of the technology. It's not a very heavy focus of this class. What is the heavy focus of this class is managerial. How can we manage technology? How can we use technology to enhance our value of the firm? Well, one consideration when we're talking about which hardware should we use is security. So, we're talking different layers of security. We're talking physical security. How can we prevent someone from walking away with a mobile device? Well, there's a lot of ways. Number one, we could lock them up physically. Another way, we could make it to where we disincentivize it, such that if someone does take a mobile device, we make it useless for them. We may use things like remote lock, to where someone steals it, it's reported stolen, then it's useless. They can't do anything with it. There's certainly a lot of examples of that. There's also, of course, going to be data security. How can we ensure the security of our data that's inside the system? Lots of different ways for that as well. We'll cover more of this in the information security chapter. But we do things like encrypt the data, making sure that it can't be easily interpreted unless people have the very specific decrypting password there. Of course, we also want to talk about space to store. Looking back at these server racks, looking back at even a desktop, it takes a lot of space to store some of this stuff. So that's a very big consideration, meaning not only do you have to have the space to store it, but you also have to have the managerial support to store the information as well. So not just the information, but the hardware. So kind of keeping that in mind and seeing that we need to have a lot of space and we need to have managerial support for that. Ownership's an interesting thing as well. Who owns the hardware? Does it make tax sense for us to own hardware? Does it make tax sense for us to lease hardware? Well, it probably makes sense to lease it. That's a very common approach because you look at any of these hardware, what's the problem with them? What's the problem with owning them? It is expensive. It's certainly going to be a very large initial investment. But another problem is they depreciate very rapidly. So if they're depreciating very rapidly, they're not going to have a very high residual value. What's the point of owning it? If in 3 years you can get drastically larger amounts of power, it's probably going to be a lot smarter to just go ahead and lease it. I do apologize for the screen. Not too sure what's going on there. But we're almost done with the slideshow, so we should be all right. So lastly, we want to talk about, or not lastly, talk about upgrading. Depending on the hardware you purchase, it can be easier or more difficult to upgrade. It's pretty much nearly impossible to upgrade anything within a smartphone, but it's not going to be nearly impossible to upgrade anything within a server. So certainly keep that in mind. If you're going to have scalable systems, it's probably going to make sense to use it. Now, of course, with scalable systems, we have a cloud computing technology chapter as well. I'm going to go ahead and say that it makes a lot more sense to use cloud computing in most cases if your concern is scalability, because you're not waiting on physical hardware. You can probably within less than an hour increase or decrease the amount of server capacity that you have with a cloud system. You can't do that with physical hardware. Whatever you currently own, it has a maximum amount of performance that you can get out of it. So kind of keep that in mind. Form factor, we just talked about that. And then lastly, just make sure the purpose of technology suits the needs of the business. It's going to look different for every business. You know, there is no rule I can say this is the hardware that any business should have, because it depends upon many different factors, what the business does, how they do it, what their strategy is, all that sort of stuff there. Any questions about today? Like I said, we're going to talk about the exam next, don't worry. But any questions about the hardware technology guide? Makes sense to everyone? All right, well, we've got the exam next Thursday. Let me pull it up in Canvas here. So it'll be open February 4th at 12:01 a.m. It's going to close at February 4th at 11:59 p.m. It's also going to be due, I believe, on February 4th at 11:59 p.m. So I'd encourage you to not start it, close to 11:59 p.m. because you want to get the full 75 minutes. So you can see here, you have the full 75 minutes. You will have 56 questions. It is open book, open note. However, it is not open other people. It's open internet though, so certainly make of that what you will. But you can't communicate with other people. That's a violation of course policies and university policies. So kind of keep that in mind there. But yeah, like I said, you can use pretty much anything else. Man, I really meant to bring in another HDMI cord, but I forgot. So I apologize about that. Let me give you guys a quick question. I like, especially for the first exam, to kind of see what the format will be. So this is one of the questions. I believe it's probably one of the tougher questions on the exam. I'll just read it off. From the perspective of fiduciary duty, what advantage does innovation have? Now, I think fiduciary duty is something we didn't really talk about in the lectures, something I meant to cover, but no one's perfect, I guess. So I'll go ahead and mention what fiduciary duty is. Fiduciary duty is saying that someone is having to act on the best interest of someone else. So in the context we're speaking of, we're talking about the company has to act in the best interest of its owners. So if we're a publicly traded firm, in many states, there's a fiduciary duty clause such that the company must act in the best interest of its shareholders. And that's true in many states, not 100% of them, but a good many. So what that means is that they have to enhance firm value. That's what their goal is to make sure that they're generating the most value for their owners. They wouldn't do a decision that would lose their owner's value, because that wouldn't be a logical decision. It may also not be a legal decision. There have been some interesting lawsuits about this. Again, we're not going to go too much in it, but that's basically what we're talking about. So when we approach this question, we're saying from that perspective of fiduciary duty. So right off the bat, what does that cue you into? You're talking about making the firm the most valuable, making it the most profitable. So we go through each of these options. Provides the firm with technological innovations. Innovation does in fact do that, but is that what fiduciary duty is looking at? It's not. Provides firm with a competitive advantage. Innovation, it can provide a firm with a competitive advantage. I would argue it doesn't inherently provide a firm with a competitive advantage. The firm would still have to take advantage of the innovations it has. You can look at a lot of famous examples. One of the most famous examples being Xerox. They had the PARC operating system, and it was a graphical user interface, and it was used by other firms. Even though they had the innovation, it was not their own competitive advantage. Other firms took advantage of it instead. So that's not a good choice. Provides the firm with increased prestige. That's not profit. That's people having a higher opinion of a firm. And then lastly, provides the firm with increased profitability. Now that is going to be the correct option for that question, because you're looking at it from the perspective of innovation. Has the capability to provide the firm with higher profitability, meaning that they can use the innovation to then further their profitability, certainly increase sales, all that sort of stuff. Does that make sense to everyone? Again, I try to bold the words that would change the definition, because otherwise, innovation could provide any of these advantages. We're looking at it from a very specific angle there. Not all the questions are this difficult. So any questions? I'm going to go ahead and pull up the form that I sent out. Any questions that are not on the form that you all have about this stuff? So again, just a reminder to everyone, any of the form or any of the terms that I sent out on a couple days ago, any of these in Unit 1, probably going to be on the exam. I'd say it's a very good bet. If anyone wants to bet against me, let me know. Wouldn't recommend it, but wouldn't mind making an extra buck or two. So yeah, any of these terms, certainly fair game. I would say that for any of the terms, make sure you know the definition, make sure you know the examples, make sure you know how and why firms would use it. Just stuff like that, you should be fine. Because open book, open note, I'm definitely not going to just ask you what is the definition of ethics. It's going to be applying ethics. It's going to be making sure you understand why and how a firm would use an ethics. So certainly that sort of thing is more of what the exam will be like, just like the question I just showed. So yeah, let's go ahead and pull up the form. All right, I'm just going to go through this response by response. How many questions? 56. How long? 75 minutes. So there will probably be some overlap with Connect. Like it says in the syllabus, 100% of the content on the exam can be answered from the lectures. Roughly 80% can be answered from the Wiley book. To be honest with you, the Connect book is not a completed book yet. So I would say probably roughly 50-60% of it can be answered using the Connect assignments. Because the Connect assignments right now, I think they have 8 chapters done out of 14. And I think I only assigned 6 out of those 14. So it's certainly going to be, some information will be overlapped, but probably not 100%. So hope that answers that. How many questions? Looks like this is a duplicate response here. Is it mostly term-based? So I wouldn't say the exam is term-based. It's application of the terms we cover. So certainly like that question I showed, that's going to be an example of a probably more difficult question, but there are going to be many other questions as well. Format of the test, multiple choice. Now, some of you will probably be glad to know, there's only going to be one answer you're going to select. It's not going to be select all that apply or anything like that. It's just going to be multiple choice, A, B, C, D, sometimes E, but yeah. All right. Are the terms you sent the only thing we need to study for the exam? I don't really know. I hesitate to say it's the only thing you should study. If you know each of those terms, that's what the exam is covering, so I'd say it'd probably be fine. And again, it's not like you have to memorize any term. You need to know how to find it very quickly, because you can probably look up, I'd say, depending on how quickly you are, you can probably look up maybe 10-20% of the questions. It's open book, open note. So, but there's a time limit, so you can't look up 100% of the questions. So certainly you need to know a good bit of it, but you don't have to know 100%. Term-based, I think I just addressed that. Formatted test, multiple choice. Terms memorized, again, it's open book, open note. I'd say you probably need to know most of them, but you don't have to know any of them if you're very quick at looking things up. It's definitely not going to be a vocabulary test. It's going to be applying the concepts. Best place to find the definitions. I don't think there's going to be a single place to find definitions. I cover them in the lecture, talking about examples and stuff like that. That's probably going to match most closely with the exam, because I make the exam questions, not a test bank or anything. You could probably use any resource you wanted. I think that the Wiley book will probably have pretty much at least a good 80%, if not closer to 90% of the definitions inside the glossary. You could also probably find a good many things on Quizlet and other sites as well. So certainly keep that in mind as well. So I think we've kind of gone through, that the exam pretty much comes straight from the lectures, but there will be some overlap with the Wiley book and less overlap with McGraw-Hill, just because it doesn't have 100% of the content yet. There's not going to be any essay. You know, so certainly don't have to worry about that. I'd have to be pretty crazy to assign an essay to a lecture section. I think I'm not that crazy. So, what will the test cover? Cover all these terms. So, just make sure you know what they are. If you have any specific questions, I'm happy to address them. How many questions? Again, there's going to be 56 questions, multiple choice. Yeah, it's open note, open book, open internet. The only thing it's not open are classmates. And that's just to keep compliance with the, what's that thing called? The honor code or whatever. Yeah, don't cheat on it. Here's a good question. Who was Edwards Deming? So Edwards Deming was a person who widely credited with a lot of what we know about quality today. So he was very adamant that quality is consistency. And we talk about what consistency is, it's basically just a low variance from one product to another product. So he worked in Japan a good bit of his career, very famous for helping out them post-war. Certainly he widely credited with a lot of stuff like that. Commoditization, it's a great question as well. Commoditization, let's back up a little bit and talk about what a commodity is. So a commodity is any standard good or service. So, you know, in the basic sense, we typically think of this as being stuff like natural resources, raw materials, because 1 gallon of gasoline, excluding stuff like additives and other stuff that they apply, is the same gallon of gasoline at any place. You know, same with water, you know, excluding any sort of additives or anything like that. A gallon of water is a gallon of water. It's going to be very standard. You know, 1 bar of gold is 1 bar of gold. So when we think about this, that's what we're talking about with commoditization. We are basically taking that concept and applying that more broadly. So the specific context for this class is commoditization of information technology. What that means is, can you take technology and is it going to be the same whether you buy it from one vendor or another? And you can certainly make an argument that it is. You can make an argument that it's not. You know, again, there's multiple perspectives here, but there is certainly going to be cases where it's inarguably a commodity. So if you can purchase the same exact piece of software from one vendor that you can from another, that's a commodity. So certainly, you know, if you go out to, for example, if you wanted to purchase a license for Microsoft Office, does it matter whether you purchase directly from Microsoft or whether you go to Staples to purchase it? The same software. That's the whole idea behind commoditization. And with that in mind, there's a larger discussion on, can you achieve competitive advantage through a commodity? You cannot. Because anyone can go out and purchase exactly what you have. It's not rare. It is, in fact, going to be valuable. It is going to be operationalizable. But it's not going to be impossible to imitate either, because literally anyone can go out and buy the same thing. So that's kind of something to keep in mind. So just in time is going to be a type of inventory management where you purchase as little as possible. You have as few of a specific type of good or service on hand at any time as possible, and instead you're going to purchase as you believe the demand will necessitate to. It's going to be very advantageous to reduce inventory holding costs. It's also going to be good to reduce inventory taxes. It's going to be good to reduce pretty much anything with inventory. However, disadvantages are you can lose demand, or not, you don't lose demand, but you can lose sales. So if you want to purchase something and you don't have ample inventory, maybe there's an unexpected surge, unless there's going to be pent-up demand, you lost out on all that revenue. So that's something to keep in mind there. Hybrid strategy. So again, we talked about the 2 major types of strategy. We have cost leadership, where we sell goods and services at the lowest possible price. We have differentiation, where we sell goods or services that we believe are different or better, or at least we provide them in a different way, something like that. And then, of course, we have focus, where we focus on a more niche market. So we have focus, low cost. We have focus, differentiation. And then hybrid is just going to be taking aspects of any of those 2 and combining them. So, you know, if we had a firm that sold very specific things at very low prices, maybe something no one else sells, that could be a hybrid strategy. So just basically combining 2 or more strategies into one. Mass customization is going to be where a company has maybe 1 or 2 or a handful of models where you can basically you have some sort of base model, and then you can have some sort of customization. It's common in cars. You know, you have the basic model of car, whatever car model. Someone throw a car model at me. Any car model. A Model T. Okay, so a Model T, probably not a great example of mass customization, because I think Henry Ford's credited with saying you can have it in any color as long as the color is black. So imagine, though, that you could change the color of the Model T. If you could, then that would be an example of mass customization, because they mass produce, but then they allow for simple customizations. Think about a laptop computer. A lot of times, you can purchase one model laptop computer, but then you have some customization options, where, sure, the motherboard probably won't change, but maybe the screen resolution will change. Maybe you can get a better screen. Maybe you can get a better or more amount of RAM. Maybe you can get larger storage, faster storage. That's pretty much the idea behind mass customization. Great questions. Let's see. Digital dossier. So digital dossier is going to be a compilation of data aggregated about a person. So that's going to be formed in the profiling process, where basically, you know, all these different advertising, they all have different amounts of information, different pieces of information about lots of people. Well, if you want to compile a digital dossier about one person, it's pretty straightforward. You just look for that identifier, whatever identifies the person, and you compile all the information together. It's going to have lots of information, demographic information, maybe some purchasing history, maybe where they live, what job they do, lots of different stuff. So second question, demand reports the same as ad hoc reports? You know, I think that demand reports is probably a typo. I'm probably meant to say on-demand reports. And yeah, that is going to be the same as an ad hoc report, because I'm pretty sure I accidentally had demand report on here. Yeah, so that should probably say on-demand report, which is going to be the same as that. It basically is saying, if you want the report, you go request the report. Then it's generated. That's what an ad hoc report is. So pretty straightforward there as well. Fiduciary duty. We covered it just to kind of recap. It's saying that you're required to act in the best interest of someone else. So in the context we're pretty much talking about the company is required to act in the best interest of shareholders. Do we have class on Thursday? No. We're not going to meet in here on Thursday. Take the test wherever you want. I'm not going to provide any limitations. I will say I recommend taking a place that you think has a very robust network. You know, it's not going to have any sort of dropping a connection, slow speed, anything like that. Use the best that you have access to. It's just a general tip there. I'm not requiring it, but I think it'd probably be better if you did. So this question says, more lecture note-based. Yeah, so definitely going to be very lecture note-based. Hopefully you took good notes. But basically, again, if you know all those terms, if you know what they are, how firms use them, you'll be fine. Vocab terms. You know, I think that there's going to be some easy questions. There's going to be some difficult questions. You know, this question that I gave about the fiduciary, this is a very difficult question. Even though I show this question every semester, a lot of people still miss it, you know. So it's not a very easy question. But I do not try to be tricky. I try to bold the terms that would otherwise change the answer of the question. So in this case, if I didn't have fiduciary duty bolded, it'd be even tougher. I'm not trying to trick you. Just trying to make sure you can apply the concepts from class. Difference between key indicators and key indicator report. Great question. So we have key indicators. What we're saying is we believe that something is important to the survival of the company. Or not only necessarily that, but it's important to one specific job. So, for example, a manager at a fast food restaurant, what they care about is going to be vastly different from what the CEO of the fast food restaurant cares about, because vastly different jobs. Now, of course, when we think about the report, all a key indicator report is just a compilation of maybe 2, possibly more key indicators onto a single report. So a lot of times it's going to be on a dashboard where it's going to update dynamically. Just kind of keep that in mind. Kaizen, great question. It's continual improvement. So going back to Deming, he's kind of famous for implementing this in a lot of the firms that he consulted for and worked for, where the whole idea is you make continual improvements over time to achieve higher quality, more consistency, less variation. Deming, I think we've covered him. Just in time, just kind of recap there. It's just not holding very much inventory. So minimizing your inventory holding. It's going to allow for lower costs, and it's going to be very beneficial in that perspective. I think we've covered this question enough. I think this is actually a repeat. So Kaizen, again, continual improvement. Any other questions I can address? Happy to address anything. Does that clarify a lot of things? I'll give you guys just a minute or two here. If you have any questions about any of these topics, anything we covered in class, I'm happy to address it. All right, well, certainly feel free if you want to come by and ask me a question after class. Certainly happy to do that. Good luck on the exam, everyone. Don't forget to submit the quizzes tonight.